My name is Yancey Red Corn, and I live here in Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma, but I'm a member of from my dad's side, the Osage tribes, and then I'm also, my mom's a Caddo and Potawatomi, so I'm also a descendant of the Caddos and the Potawatomis. For the Osages specifically, when we moved here in 1872, and we bought that 1.1 million acres. We paid $1 million for it out of our own money and paid for it. And the reason the leaders of the Osages that came down and looked at it, and they said it was rocky. And so they went, you can't farm this area. So the white man's not going to want this at all. So they picked it because of that. And there was rivers and stuff, and there was game and things like that they could do, fish and hunt. But what was interesting is like in 1900 they discovered oil on it, and it was the biggest oil and gas deposit back then in the world. And so you had people like Getty coming in, and John Phillips, Henry Sinclair, Rockefellers, all of those, J.P. Morgan, all of those big time, a lot of them got rich off the Osages when they came in and started drilling, and then they boomed up and became, really, really wealthy. And the Osages just got royalties out of it, and it was, it was enough. And then in the 1920s, it was really booming, and all of the Osages were basically millionaires, and that was just an incredible amount of money in the 1920s that they had at their expense. The colonial attitude of the indigenous people don't deserve that. And even back in the 1920s, they didn't, they would kill us, but nobody would investigate it because they didn't consider us human beings. They considered us like animals. And I could see that would probably be the same thing in Australia, that the Australian government looked at the Aborigines and saying that they're not deserving of this, they're just animals, they're not human beings. And that's colonialism too, but the difference with that is that Australia never got rid of the British, and so there was no other new constitutions and things that were written, as opposed to the United States, where they wrote a constitution and got their independence. But the reason they wrote, like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin looked at the Iroquois Nation up in upstate New York, and they were like, man, these guys they have this government within it where everybody's making a decision, and it's like a democracy, and they're all free. They don't have to answer to anybody. And so part of that, of the Constitution, was written from the viewpoint of the tribes that were free, and Jefferson and all of them, and Ben Franklin, all the smart guys, they were like, these guys are free, we still have to deal with the king. So when they wrote the Constitution, they wrote it like the Iroquois Nation, which had different parts of the Iroquois Confederacy is what they would call it, and they kind of wrote it as that because they had people. Everybody was equal, and they had different decision makers, kind of like Congress, that would help, and they would all make decisions for the better good, and that was what Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin were hoping it would happen. But in the Constitution they wrote, Congress can only make treaties with foreign nations, and then they wrote in there, and Indians. So we were written in the Constitution, and no one thought anything about it that much, and we won and lost cases from the late 1700s all the way up to now. Yeah. But in the late 60s, for my dad's generation, they started becoming educated, and then we had these Native attorneys start, probably late 60s, early 70s, and started reading the treaties from a constitutional viewpoint and from the law, and they were like, these treaties are still alive, and it's based under the Constitution, and this is what we can start doing. In like 1974, that's why they pushed through the Indian Self-Determination Act, where tribes were able to determine their own memberships, their own government, and kind of started moving that way, able to do all the different stuff, and it just progressed from there to where now we have casinos and hospitals and things like that. But that's the difference. Unfortunately for the Aborigines, there's not anything in whatever the government over there that's written in there that they can take a bite off of it and make it into something better, which it's still not great for tribes. There's still tribes out in the middle of nowhere that have nothing, living in shacks. And it's just, Pine Ridge is just really bad, and there's all these different, a lot of poverty and a lot of alcoholism, a lot of drugs now. Meth is going through, but meth's going through everywhere. Meth's going through Oklahoma, not just natives, but also non-natives.
Could you talk a bit about the sort of impact of the Reign of Terror and whether or not it still has resonance today?
Yeah, well, my sister's a doctor, she's a psychiatrist, and we were talking recently about intergenerational trauma, and so all of that was happening in the 20s, and people were getting murdered, and you didn't know who to trust, and luckily my grandparents, they both survived through it. My great-grandfather didn't, but
he was poisoned.
Yes,
yeah.
And so my dad's older brother wasn't born until 1934, and then my dad was born in 36, and they had 3 others after that. But because my grandparents lived through that time, they helicoptered them, and like, where are you at? Where are you going? I don't think you should do this. I don't know. And all the time, constantly wanting to know where they're at. And my dad that did that to me, and I did it to my son.
Yeah.
And I think it's just something in us that anything out of the ordinary could happen, and you could get killed. And so it's always in our head, even though we really don't have to worry about that, but we still do. And
still very much the protecting.
Well, I worry now because of what's going on with white supremacy starting to come back around, and like I'll walk in the evening, but I'll always walk by the University of Oklahoma there, because I don't want to walk around the neighborhood and worry about a brown-haired, long-haired guy getting pulled over by the police, or some hate crime people coming by and attacking me. So you still have to. Now you have to think about that, and I can't believe that I have to think about that. But you got to be aware of your surroundings and that kind of stuff. And it's not as bad as the African Americans. It's really bad with them, even now.
It's interesting to me, having learned a bit about in the time that we're here, that seems to be a thing now where we're talking to Larry from the Native Congress of the American Indian, and he was saying, there's a real fear still about termination and stuff like that in terms of completely dissolving tribes and things like that. And what you said there with white supremacy, this idea that old things that happened in the past can always come back in, right? The cycle still comes back in.
Right.
I would think that your father's book and the movie that you're in and other cultural contributions in the arts would help serve as a warning post, I suppose, of this is what's happened in the past, but we can't go through this again.
Right.
Or we shouldn't for any other reason. But that it serves as a demonstration of what has occurred and the importance of making sure history is not repeated. It seems like there's still a real fear.
Right. Well, and Scorcese does a good job at he consulted with the tribe, and he got with their language people and with the costumes, working with all tribal members and people on the crew, and he used me as a consultant too. I was just one of many, and he really showed how bad it was. I mean, and showed. I mean, because it is about white supremacy, and he showed the attitudes really well of the local white people, as they would say.
I've only seen the trailer, like most people,
Right.
but it seems incredibly suffocating to watch. It's terrible. Like it's quite confronting. I'm 18,000 kilometers away from.
Right. I'm good friends with David Grant, who wrote Killers of the Flower Moon, and I was talking to him before we saw it over in Cannes. We were having dinner, and I was talking with him, and I said, "Man, what do you think of that trailer, the last trailer where the DiCaprio was?" And I can talk about this because it's a trailer, and DiCaprio's reading that thing. Can you find the wolves in this picture? And then, I mean, it was just a creepy trailer. And then at the end, it shows all of those white people turning and looking at the camera. Can you find the wolves in that? And I was telling David Grant, I go, what? I go. They say, can you find the wolves in this picture? And he said, every fucking one of them. That's a quote from David Grant.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can publish that, but
we're in Australia. You can say that. It's fine.
Right. But he was like, he just immediately, he said, every fucking one of them.
Yeah. Oh wow.
Because I mean, he really did the research, and he just was like flabbergasted about everything that they did.
And the compounding effect of it. It wasn't, it's not just as if there was one heinous thing. It was so many repeated, all the way through.
Right.
From what I've read about the Reign of Terror, what I've read about what occurred there, it's terrible. We don't have anything quite like that in Australia in terms of a deliberate conspiracy.
Right.
There's been plenty of what our mobs call battles and things like that with very early colonial forces.
Right.
But nothing in that more contemporary sense in terms of in the 1920s.
Right.
The idea, structurally, there's the racism. There's the institutionally that exists still to this day.
Right.
It's still a significant problem that our people face. But the idea of such an event like that, and I say event, it's a terrible series of events, really.
Right.
Is something we just don't have, and I think it's going to be really interesting. More people become educated about the Reign of Terror for us.
Well, it's going to be world. It opens limited theaters October 6th, but then it's going worldwide October 20th. And when I was in Cannes, the hotel I stayed in, which was security, and they wouldn't let anybody in there, but there was also directors from other countries and actors from other countries that had their stuff there too, and some of them were able, because I don't know, maybe because they're a director and they're part of this and that, and they got to go see the premiere. And so the next morning I'm walking in the hotel, and this happened to me several times, but I'll just give you one example of this African, I don't know what country he's from, but he's a director, and he was talking to me in his accent, and he said, I saw that last night. He goes, thank you for being in. I mean, he was just thanking me, but he was getting real emotional, and he goes, that movie is, you think that it's just about Osages. He goes, that movie's about my people too. That's what happened to my people, and this story needs to be told internationally. And he's so glad it is going to go international. And I ran into several other people from different countries, and they were the same way, very emotional. They were just like, this story, it's so great that it's going to be international because that story's about my people too. And I mean, it's all over the world. I mean, colonialism is all over the world, and the damage that it's done, and traumatized, and
In the book that your father wrote, was it a motivation for him to tell a story so people would in the same way, I suppose, affect understand it and try and affect some change? Was that something that was important to him?
He's always been a great writer. He had it in his head for a long time about what he wanted to do, and it's from all the stories from his great-grandfather's younger brother became his grandfather.
Yeah, right.
And so they were born in the 1880s, and they were traditional Osages. So my dad was really close with his, he just called him his grandfather.
Yeah.
And hung out and listened. And my dad was an old soul. When he was a kid, he enjoyed listening and hanging out with the elders.
Yeah.
And he was also a genius. I mean, he was just brilliant. But he just listened to all the stories and listened to all the stories about what happened in the, starting when he was born in the early 1900s and all this stuff. So he understood all of that. And in my dad's book, at the start of the book, the prologue is in early 1900s. They're burying the pipe, and they're burying the pipe because that has to do with all of these ceremonies that they've had, and they're burying it because they realize they can't do everything that they can with the ceremonies, and that the white man's coming in and taking over, and in order to survive, they've got to bury all of that, and so that the kids can survive, because if not, then they would just get probably mowed over and killed. So he heard that from, I call him my Uncle Waken, but he's like my great grandfather. And so he heard those stories, and then he heard how they lived in the 1920s, and my grandparents, how they lived. They had, multiple houses and chefs and chauffeurs and, like I said, riding stables and things like that. And they could afford anything they wanted to. So he also heard about the parties and the trips they take to Colorado and the trips they take to Arkansas and all that stuff. Like they'd go to Colorado and spend the summer just to get away from the heat.
Yeah.
So they had that kind of money where they could go up there and just take all the kids and hang out there for the summer. And so he heard all these individual stories and he put it together, but he also heard how they were ripped off and how my great-grandfather's attorney ripped them off with,
the
land
Yeah.
and all this other stuff. My great-grandfather, they used his money to build a big hotel in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, and they said it was his and he was an owner of it. And so he was asking more questions, and then they said, it's too bad they didn't make any money and they had to file for bankruptcy, and then they sold it to a friend for nothing, and they owned it. So what they did is they used the guardians, who was the attorney, used my great-grandfather's money to build that hotel and to get it going and stuff like that, and then they filed for bankruptcy, and then so my dad, that's in my dad's book. But there's also, so he heard all these stories and he put it all together and he wrote his book, and that's what also, it's called The Pipe of February, but David Grand read it and then called my dad and came to the Osage reservation, and my dad showed him around at all the different places in the book, and then it helped him to keep doing his research and writing. That's how my dad became really good friends with David Grand, and then how I became really good friends with him too. And so that helped it. And then also Martin Scorcese read it, and he loved it. And so he put some elements of my dad's book in there because it gives a little more Osage viewpoint in it. And so, I'm pretty proud of the fact that, and then we republished my dad's book, and Martin Scorcese wrote a foreword for it, and David Grand wrote a blurb for it. So it's out now. And using that, my son wrote a script. He's 23 years old, and he's a great writer. My dad's writing ability jumped to him. And so he wrote a script for my dad's book to put it in a TV miniseries, and he worked for Scorcese during the film and became friends with him. Well, and I did too. So he and I presented it to him, and Scorcese said he's going to mentor it. He's not going to direct it or anything, but he'll mentor it and help it. And we're working with his agent producers and stuff right now. We just had a meeting with them last week, and as soon as the SAG thing's over, we'll be moving it to turn it into a TV miniseries. And what we can do with that is we can bring a lot more elements in the miniseries and really tell a complete story. It's from the Osage viewpoint, so you'll see a lot more. It's completely different than Killers of the Flower Moon.
Do you think it's a I mean, obviously in that case, it's been continual contributions by your family then, in terms of telling the story,
Right.
To the broader public.
Right.
Do you think is that a mark of the necessity of survivorship? Is that just the motivation?
We're and most tribes we're very oral tradition.
Yeah.
And so, my great grandfather, he was telling stories that he heard from his dad, who heard it from his dad. So knew all the stories coming, from 1700s, 1600s, when we were in Missouri. And then my great grandfather, which was my great uncle, he was a name giver in our tribe, in our clan. So there's several clans, but in our specific clan, which is the Scorcese clan, which is the Peacemaker clan, he was a name giver in it. And so anybody that's born into that clan, he gives them a traditional Osage name, and it's a certain way of doing the ceremony and stuff. And then he passed it down to my dad, and my dad passed it down to me, and now I'm a name giver. I'm the name giver in my clan, and so you have to pass it down before you die, or else it just dies.
Gotcha.
Because my dad passed it down to me when I was 18, but I would just go to him with the namings and just kind of support him and learn how it goes. And then I passed it down to my son when he was and my nephew, so they could both do it when they were about 18. And so he's 23 now, so he'll take over after I'm dead and gone. After my dad passed away in 2017, I was like, I better pick somebody to pass this down. I could die tomorrow, and
Yeah.
And so I did that. But so I mean, but that ceremony it's the oldest ceremony that Osages have. It goes back, 1,000 years,
Yeah.
and so we're still keeping that one going and doing it the way, and still naming people in our clans the clan names that they have to be within that clan for first son, second son, third son, first daughter, second daughter, third daughter, and things like that. There's certain names for each one of those categories. And so my dad was really good at keeping an archive. And so I can reference different, going back to when he was naming them, and kind of reference different families that were within the clan.
That's right.
So that's lucky. And that's not oral. But it's all written, and I need to transfer it and come into the 21st century.
Yeah.